We're here today with Jason Polios at the Iowa City Public Library. We're very grateful for that ongoing partnership. So thank you for being here, Jason, and making this all work.
Thank you all.
There, there is down below a Q&A function. So if you have questions, please just tuck your question there and I'll monitor the questions and I will try to keep an eye out as we're talking. Feel free to go ahead and ask a question, but I'll also really look toward the end to make sure that I catch your questions. The session is being recorded and it'll be publicly available soon on the Iowa City Public Library website and the Obermann website. So just to start us off, our subject tonight is child care and the notion of care more generally and the ethics of care more generally. And as we all know, though people talk about child care as a parental issue, the fact of the matter is everybody's affected by child care. Parents and guardians of the children who are balancing work and child care, their families, other members of the family, like elderly family members who also need care, employers and colleagues at work who count on people with children to be part of the community of workers, the employees and the employers in the child care profession, and most importantly, the children themselves. And our group that's here tonight talked earlier last week about how we wanted to frame things today. And we were interested in the way the phrase crisis of care has been appeared so frequently in the press recently. But and it's been heightened because so many childcare workers left the profession during COVID. But we really want to think about that rhetoric for what it means when this is a much longer term and evolving concern. And so I'm really grateful today to be here with two great colleagues, a campus and a community expert, to bring perspective to the issues and give us a lot of insights. So let me introduce them and off we'll go. Jennifer Banta is the Vice President at Iowa City Area Business Partnership. And Jennifer started the Johnson County Child Care Coalition that brought together a number of community members and led to conversations about barriers to child care locally. And Jennifer is also a member of the state level Early Childhood Iowa Board. Asha Banduri is a professor and my colleague in the Department of Gender, Women, Sexuality Studies, and also in philosophy. She's a political philosopher and a feminist ethicist. And she has a book from 2020 called Freedom to Care, Liberalism, Dependency, Care, and Culture that addresses many of the broader issues surrounding care. And she's also co-editor of a 2021 book called Caring for Liberalism, Dependency and Liberal Political Theory. Asha also serves on the advisory board for the CARE Forum, which is an international cooperative group that shares new work in the field of care theory. And she's especially interested in the ways, as is Jennifer actually, the ways that the profession of caregiving is affected not only by gender and economics, but also by race and ethnicity. So to get us started, Jennifer, you really have a large view of the landscape in Johnson County and Iowa. And I wondered if you would just give us some background based on your work with Johnson County and state level committees to sort of set the table for the conversation.
Well, yes, and thank you so much for hosting this conversation because it is so incredibly important, like you said, to our entire community. So I want to kind of start off with just giving you some background on our major challenges here in Johnson County. As you mentioned, many childcare workers left the workforce during COVID, and many of those folks have not returned back into the childcare industry. One of the major issues we have in Johnson County here is the cost of care. An average family with two children they're typically paying over $2,000 a month for care. And that is an incredible amount for any family to bear. The availability is another huge issue that we're having here in Johnson County, especially for newborns. It is very hard to find newborn care here in Johnson County. And according to the Iowa Women's Foundation, there are 2.3 children in Johnson County for every one child care spot available. And since we have such a large workforce participation rate here for our community, that's a really huge challenge. Johnson County Social Services just did a survey last month and found out that many of our childcare providers or childcare centers are not fully staffed. So there are empty classrooms. There's classrooms that are only halfway full because we can't find childcare workers. And I know we'll get more into that later in Asha's work, especially with just treating this profession like a profession and a valued profession within our community, and then also paying them as such, I think is one of the things that we're really struggling with here. So I spoke specifically about Johnson County because that's where I'm doing my work and that's where I know the most. So the state of Iowa has a variety of different challenges. Our rural communities suffer from a lack of infrastructure. That's not our problem here in Johnson County. We have the infrastructure, we just don't have the childcare workforce. So just a little bit of a background.
And while we're on that background, when we talked earlier, I thought so striking when you talked to us about what you actually do make as a childcare worker. Could you say a little bit about the salary issue?
Yes. So the average salary of a childcare worker in the state of Iowa is only $22,000 a year. Here locally in Johnson County, the starting wage for a classroom assistant is $12 an hour, and the starting wage for a lead teacher within a classroom is $16 an hour. And that lead teacher has a 4-year college degree. So $16 an hour is that starting wage.
And I think, just to give even more of a framework, I believe that the Canvas system just raised the salary of student bus drivers to $18 an hour, by comparison, which is just stunning.
It is. I think I saw McDonald's is paying $18 an hour. We did a study this summer, just calling around and asking, what are your starting wages? And, from Target to Walmart to the Canvas, you can work pretty much anywhere and make more than that $12 an hour. So.
Yeah, thank you. And Asha, your work really makes the case that when we are talking about childcare, that we need to think about childcare in the framework of elder care, of many other forms of caretaking, but even more broadly through the lens of an ethics of care and a social commitment to those ethics. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about that broader context of the work you've done.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Teresa. And also, I'm so happy to be here as part of this panel. Just to reflect first on something that Jennifer was saying, I think that the sort of the low wages really reflect the way that we don't value caregiving as a sort of arena for, really sophisticated sort of a sophisticated exercise of skills to, meet people's needs. And we don't also really value the way that attachment matters and can occur in a professional context. We kind of operate with a dichotomy that places either care in the home and then you acknowledge that attachment matters, or we say that it's in the market and we're going to pay for it, and then we're not thinking about all of these robust goods that are cultivated through attentive caregiving. And so, to back up a little bit to answer your question, Teresa, about the ethics of care, that's one of the sort of new moral frameworks that was developed in the last 50 years or so. And centers the role of caring relationships in our moral lives. It says that, caring relationships have central value, and the skills that people have that they exercise when they're caring for others have robust value. That it's not, so it's a feminist ethic in that it rejects the idea that impartial thinking and principle-based thinking is really the rational way to go about things, and that has more value. And emoting and being responsive to particular others, that has less value, and that's kind of a feminine concept. Instead, Sarah Ruddick, a philosopher, theorized about caregiving practice in a way that looked to the work that mothers have done. She talked about it as maternal thinking, and she showed that it's an intellectual practice. It's a very sophisticated practice that includes a number of aims that are sort of achieved for the child. And so I think, when we're thinking about what would a just caring society be, what would a just society be where we understand that we all need to receive care, for many years of our lives, and that, many people are providing care, what would that society be? We need to think about how to really build in the positive value of caregiving, while also recognizing in my work, I also highlight that we have to recognize both sides of the value of care. There's a kind of dual-sided nature to it, which is that it has, value for the person receiving it. For the caregiver, there's also value because the caregiver can exercise this really complicated capacity and support the relationship, but it's also a burden for the caregiver. And so, providing that care can be a burden if someone's providing too much care without support, if they're providing care and then they cannot care for the people they love. So if they're, as the history of racialized care has sort of shown, if, people of color are providing care to white families and they can't then provide care, for their own families, or as it happens even, without racial lines in Romania, Romanian care workers travel away and then their children suffer a care deficit, right? So these flows occur in multiple places. Well, that then can be a harm. So we need to be thinking about the different dimensions of, the relationships of value to people and the labor of care. And then we need to be thinking about how can we make space in our society so that people can provide care to the people they care about, and where it's both a profession, that gets highly valued, that gets, I think the work Jennifer has been doing is so exciting and really, really important, that gets more support, while we also think about how we're structuring our society and our work lives and the expectations about the market economy to leave robust room for care and human life.
Jennifer, was there anything you wanted to add to that before I move on?
No, I think that really sums it up, because so much of what I'm trying to focus on is bringing attention to the fact that oftentimes the folks that are doing this care are providing such a essential service, and yet at the same time sort of sacrificing their own families, their own health, and then potentially even just not being recognized for it in the way that we need to at such an important time of life.
Well, and that kind of leads me to a question that I think connects the comments you both just made, and that is there's childcare and then there's quality childcare. I know that's something that you think about a lot, Jennifer, and it's implicit in what you were saying too, Asha. And I mean, how does Johnson County, how do people in this profession define quality child care? Maybe that's a question for you, Jennifer, because I know it's something that there are actual material practices that try to get us there.
Well, yes, of course, there's the credentialing the CDA, the early childhood education that you can receive also through the universities. UNI has an early childhood program that's really wonderful. There's also what I would say with quality. One of the things I like to really just expand people's view of that, it's the food, it's the curriculum, it's the care, it's the access to outdoor and natural spaces. It's also access to expanded hours of care. Oftentimes when we talk about care, we all have 9-to-5 jobs, although we're working a little late tonight, but we have 9-to-5 jobs typically. And so we think childcare should be happening within those hours, right? Well, there's a lot of people that work weekends or evenings, especially at the university with all the healthcare workers and so on and so forth. So it's important to think about quality, but it's also important to think about quality and expanded hours and access to care on the weekends or non-traditional hours. The other thing I would like to just articulate is the importance of that bond, not only just between the child and the caregiver, but also the caregiver and the parent. And so if we don't have culturally appropriate care, where the care provider is able to speak in the same language as the parent and be able to communicate and be able to talk about problems and things that are going on with that child, that's also incredibly important. So there's quality, like on the quality rating scale and being state certified and having all of those credentials. But I think that it goes beyond that as well with that expanded care, and then having folks having that cultural competency is important as well too.
And just to jump in on the quality of care point, I think also continuity of care is so essential. And this is, something that, of course, there's a lot of literature about in the medical field, but, for early childhood care, continuity of caregivers has so much value. And so there are models where, there are professional caregivers for whom it's their full-time job, they get good benefits, and they're with, say in a mixed age group, they're with the children for 3 years. And those children really then are able to have that sense of sort of security in that daycare setting, in addition to with their parents. And, I think sometimes there's a, well, I'll kind of cycle back to that false dichotomy that I was talking about earlier. I think sometimes there's a concern that if we talk about continuity and attachment, that then the case for sending moms back into the home and out of the workplace is going to be strengthened. And I think it's kind of historically false and false across cultures, because there have been many different people caring for children in a lot of different settings, in a lot of different societies. It's rarely, well, statistically, I don't know if it's rarely, but there are many counterexamples to, say, the mother, a biological mother caring for the child. So thinking of those caregivers as also central people in the child's life, as members of that familial unit, I think is a really kind of an important thing to embrace. And I think it increases the social valuing of caregivers. Right. And then, I guess in terms of providing more high quality caregivers, one of the proposals that I've made is that we should be teaching caregiving skills to young boys in public schools in order to increase the pool of potential caregivers beyond girls who are socialized often at an early age to attend to the needs of others, to pay attention, to express consideration. But because caregiving is also intrinsically rewarding, it's a kind of activity that has a lot of rewards for the caregiver. It's something that I think would really plausibly be a viable career for a lot of boys and a lot of men, if we are able to start teaching those skills at a younger age.
And I'll just say again that those of you who are listening, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A, and I will be watching to make sure we get to your questions. That your comment makes me think about a question we probably could have talked about at the very beginning, and that is, who are caregivers? And Jennifer, I know you, in the research you've done on the state as part of these committees, you have some sense of that. What are the different kinds of childcare facilities that people can choose from if they're fortunate, and who are the workers?
Well, that is a really great question. And typically, to the point that Asha was making earlier, it's typically women. It is oftentimes women who have small children, so that they can bring their young children to work with them and have them be in the center while they are also able to work. Obviously, we have licensed, registered child care centers with QRS codes of 4 or 5 stars, but we also have unregistered in-home centers that are not licensed and don't maybe have a lot of credentialing or any credentialing for that matter. So the care really runs the gamut. And I'm not implying that those unlicensed, unregistered homes are not suitable. There is just a wide variety. There's the state of Iowa has very few regulations and barriers to providing childcare in the state. So, it can be just about anybody, but it seems to be women, younger women. And as soon as they are able to have their children in school, it seems like then they move on to other careers as well that are a little bit more lucrative, which is going back to Teresa, your comment, that continuity of care. There is a lot of turnover in that industry, going back to pay equity. So.
Mm-hmm. And thinking about your earlier comment, both of you are reflecting on how important it is, but you had said specifically, Jennifer, that children and families have caretakers who are familiar with their worlds and their cultures and their languages. How are we doing in Iowa on that score? Do we know?
Well, there are pockets. The Lutheran Services of Iowa has been doing great work in the Des Moines area. Our coalition, especially 4Cs, Missy Forbes, just launched a program, an Earn and Learn program with Kirkwood Community College to help folks that are working on their ESL to be placed within a child care facility to do an apprenticeship program and get the credentialing and the skills that they need in order to maybe be able to start their own centers, or at least be able to work within a center where they are speaking the same language as the parents and the children that are coming in the door. So that, I think, is a really important point. I think that we need to have access to childcare within your community, within your micro neighborhood, so that your care is close to home, and that is so, I think, incredibly important for our community.
And Asha, I wonder, in the conversations that you're in more broadly, how are philosophers and ethicists thinking about what it would take to move a society to think differently about the value of care and support for the people who want to be part of this profession and able to do so?
Yeah, well, there's such a rich, vibrant discourse now around care theory. It's really a very active area of research, and so some of the questions that I think are perhaps there are questions about like the value of care, and then really there's a lively debate about what the point of the economy is. So, the economy, the word economy comes from the Greek word oikos, and it was based on the household, the management of the household, which was the place where people got had all of their needs met. It was sort of designed for sustenance of individuals. And it included extended family. It was a kind of broader working unit. It's not the same thing as the market, right? And so care theorists are really pushing, we're pushing for us to really, as a society, to really start thinking about what the proper role of the market is. So the market, can play a sort of selective role in certain caregiving arrangements, and I think it's essential for it to do so in the short term. When we have a lot is marketized, and so we have to kind of in the short term engage in that way. But we also have to be thinking in a more kind of visionary way about what kind of society would be an ideal society. And that's where the market does get limited, where we can live lives of value that have time and space for care, as well as other goods, where care is not the only good. So, that's one of the really kind of the big threads in care theory right now. And then there are some really interesting, proposals, and I think we'll get to maybe some more of those applied proposals later, but a couple of them include like a care corps. So the idea that maybe youth would all need to serve for a year in a care corps to learn caregiving skills and to provide care. Perhaps, it would have to be for a population who it would be sort of appropriate to be a caregiver for, on an occasional basis. But that's a way to build it in, to our society, and to recognize that it's as essential as, fighting to protect, a country from attack. Or there are different proposals like kind of changing marriage law in different ways to recognize caregiving relationships. My proposal to teach boys caregiving skills, which, gets at the heart of gender and socialization in a way. So it's certainly a proposal that meets some resistance on that basis, but it's also, care is just as fundamental as basic math skills, right? So it's something that we need to have in the society. So those are kind of two of the branches of care theory. And then, of course, there are lively debates about as you can tell from my book titles, I've defended a kind of liberalism, which really actually values individual autonomy and freedom, and says that we need to arrange our caregiving practices in a way that enables everyone to be free, especially women of color. So when it's no longer assumed that women and women of color are going to be caregivers for the world in an invisible way, then that means that we have to redistribute our understanding of and the facts of caregiving so that freedom is equally accessible. So there are big debates about kind of the background, what is care compatible with? I argue for this kind of liberalism. There are plenty of care theorists who argue for a more kind of radical care that doesn't include that focus on the sort of individual human's freedom.
Thank you. And Jason very kindly dropped a link to your work in chat for people who'd like to follow up on that. And we also have several questions that have popped up. So let me take us to those. Megan asks, I would love to hear thoughts from guests about how low wages and benefits impact the quality of care, bringing together two strands we've talked about. Asha talked a little bit about the care burden. How does low pay impact provider stress and subsequently interactions with children?
I think I'll just jump in and say, I think that you're seeing it in the fact that so many folks have left the childcare industry. I hate to call it an industry, but they've left that profession. And I think that our childcare workers are stressed. They've been through a lot over the last few years, probably right up there with nurses and doctors. They have been on the front lines trying to work with families who really needed care and, putting themselves at risk during the pandemic to make sure that they could take care of our children. And then I would also just mention that last year during legislative session, our Iowa legislature expanded the number of children that childcare providers can take care of. I've talked to many childcare centers and childcare providers about that, and just bumping up those numbers so that that providers are taking care of more children is causing a lot of stress. And a lot of centers have not increased the number of children that providers are looking after because it is a high demand, or it's a demanding job, obviously. So putting more children in the care of a caregiver is creating more stress and in an already stretched thin environment. Many of our childcare centers, when we were out doing those surveys last month, we found out that a lot of our centers are understaffed. So if a classroom teacher needs to have a sick day or needs to go to the doctor, or needs to, do anything, there's no backup. And so many centers, just like our schools, are doing double duty and having to cover for each other and work really weird shifts. So I think it has been very stressful. And I do, to this, to Megan's point, I think it does impact the quality of care.
Sorry, were you going to jump in, Asha?
I'll just jump in to say that I agree, absolutely with Jennifer, that it affects the quality of care. And I think there's it's an interaction, right? So there's a kind of cycle there. And really, I would just pose, for all of us, what is it that is more important than care for our most vulnerable members of society? I mean, I think that's really, it's the way to measure the humanity of a society, to see how we treat our most vulnerable people. And children, of course, I mean, the way that we're caring for them has huge effects on our society overall, in the long term, and the way that we're raising them. So, I mean, I think finding ways to reprioritize caregiving so that caregivers are, paid very well. It should be a highly respected career. Is a pretty essential priority.
And the next question actually gets at that tension directly. Cassie says, you mentioned that the high cost of childcare and the low pay for childcare workers. And, how do we balance cost to families with the paying staff what they're worth?
Yeah, and I think sometimes people don't fully understand childcare is a business. Even if it's a nonprofit, it is a business. And so businesses need to make money. And what's going on right now in the childcare industry is really interesting because we don't have economies of scale. I always like to use a university classroom as an example, since we're all really familiar with that. You can put 400 students in a university classroom, or you can put, 8 or 10. But the more students you're able to put into a classroom, the more money you're making. With childcare centers, really, you can't reach those economies of scale. You can't pack a bunch of, let's say 33-year-olds into a classroom. You just can't do it. And so there's not the economy of scale. The other issue that's been going on is insurance premiums have gone up. All the expenses, food. If I'm paying more for food, childcare centers are paying more for food as well. And then the last thing I want to mention too is each child needs so many square feet in that classroom. So we need to buy bigger spaces to give children more room to roam within that classroom. Well, here in Iowa City, it's pretty darn expensive. Rent is high here. So there are so many different factors. And we did see a number of our childcare provider at the centers increase wages quite a bit. But what happened with that was when they increased the wages of their workers, that immediately impacted what parents were paying. And so it's just such a tightrope. And I have laid awake many a night trying to figure out the math, and I'm not good at math, but trying to figure out the financials of this. And I just don't know how you do it without some sort of subsidy or some sort of government intervention. And that gets back to what we were talking about earlier with the value. What value are we placing on these caregivers?
And I mean, further support for the, the government, the idea that there should be some sort of subsidy, some sort of governmental support for caregiving is the fact that there are a number of public goods that we all collectively pay for, right, through taxes, that are sort of part of daily life. So highways are one example, right? Of course, public schools are another example. And so, I mean, recognizing that it's not the case that we want children to just simply be at home with their parents is maybe the first step to coming to support a proposal for public support for childcare, right? So, I mean, I think there are some complicated politics there, but the consequences of having good childcare, publicly funded childcare, would be great, and I would bet that any economic analysis of that would show that it would pay off, that we would financially benefit.
So, in the President Biden did have in the Build Back Better plan that childcare expenses for a family would be capped at 7%. That was in the proposed bill. What's exciting about that, to your point, is we've put a number on what families should pay, 7% of your take-home pay. In Johnson County right now, this is based on that survey I've been talking about. An average family in Johnson County is paying 30% of their take-home pay on childcare. That is more than, or about the same as what you should be spending on your mortgage, right? So I think coming up with very clear economic mile markers on, how much should families be paying. And to your point too, public schools are paid for, and there is more cognitive development happening ages 0 to 4 than after that point, right? So if we want to all realize that this is about the child's cognitive development, and it's about their test scores in 3rd grade and 11th grade, and it's really about equity in education, it really does start at birth and having access to high quality childcare.
And 2 questions I'm going to combine because they both kind of connect to this question is Meenakshi Gigi asks how we explain why do you think people resist state support, given what you've just both been saying, state support for childcare and early childhood education? And she points especially to Head Start programs and the way that that there's so much evidence of the value of those programs, and just the way you were saying. She goes on to say Asha's discussion of the value of childcare to the economy and the market is significant because there's all this research of the increasing benefits incredibly over time. And so why are we so resistant, and why does this become such a politicized issue, do you think?
I'll jump in here. I mean, I think that it has to do with patriarchy and sexism, really. So, I think that the sort of the idea that women should be and mothers should be in the home with the children really drives that resistance. And I think the experience that a lot of working mothers, have, I know there are many in our audience today, is that, as a working mother in Iowa with, a small child, it's very difficult to find childcare, as, Jennifer has been identifying the hard statistics about that. And many mothers wonder if they just will then need to quit their job and stay home, even if that's not what they really want to do. So there are very real pressures that result from as I think, as Gigi states it very well, the willful, did she say willful negligence? It is quite willful. And I think the aim is really to forestall gender equity. I mean, it's really resistance to a fully gender just society.
Well, and I also think, the question of whether we see ourselves collectively as a community of care, whether or not we have children, whether or not, if we do have children, they're grown, long gone from home. And what does it take to promote that sense of being a larger community of care, responsible for all the children in your world, in the state, in the country. And I think that's part of the question too, how that happens. And that point, at that part of the question might tie to Joanna's question when she asks how the efforts that we've been discussing here align with the Better Together 2030 initiative and the United Way's Young Children programs. I mean, in some ways, that's an attempt. I would get both are attempts to build that sense of communal responsibility. But Jennifer, you're probably the most familiar with those two programs. You have thoughts about that?
Yeah, so Better Together 2030 is a community visioning process that our community has been going through the last 12 months or so. And really, I'm going to put a link in the box, in the chat box in a minute. But really, when we talk about childcare, it's identified as pillar number 2 on the community vision, which is authentic, vibrant neighborhoods and districts. And that's what I was getting at earlier with each neighborhood should have access to care, whether that's for children, they should have access to food and nature, and making sure that each one of those neighborhoods is unique and really supports the people that live there. So Better Together 2030, I'm really excited about that as a way to highlight a lot of different initiatives going on, but especially childcare. We have kicked off a project, a wage enhancement initiative with the Community Foundation of Johnson County and the county. Johnson County was the first in with $750,000, and the city of Iowa City has matched that. So we're going to be starting early next year, providing $2 an hour wage enhancements for full-time childcare workers in Johnson County that qualify. So there are a couple of stipulations, but our goal is to really elevate that profession in a couple of different ways, but starting with wages. And I feel like there was a part 2 with the United Way. Yeah, absolutely. The United Way is committed to early education as well, and is part of the Better Together 2030 project. So, yeah.
And sorry, Asha, were you going to jump in? No, okay. I'm just making sure I didn't miss questions. There were a couple of questions that I had slid past, and one of them that's a tough one is Hannah is really interested in the care core idea that you mentioned, Asha, and several people comment about the gender issues and the fact that caregiving is so stigmatized as women's work, but also raises the tough question of, over and over, the stereotypes are that it would be problematic to have men working with children, with young children, and whether, that's safe or not. And I mean, I wonder how do we overcome those stereotypes, and where that, why is that such a preoccupation?
Well, I mean, I think that the sort of the stereotypes about male identity also extend to the idea that men should not really be attentive to the needs of others. It's kind of a fundamental aspect of masculinity. You know, when we see how masculinity gets portrayed in film and, you know, exemplified by certain individuals, it really includes a kind of, you know, deliberate disregard. What, not deliberate, it doesn't appear to be deliberate, but disregard for the needs of others, right? And so, I mean, I think that really emphasizing the value of these skills and moving away from those constructions of masculinity and femininity is essential. And I do think that you know, I do think the younger generations have done that. I think a lot of you know, men are fully engaged in caregiving today. A lot of you know, younger men, like in their, you know, 20s, are not at all invested in that idea of masculinity. I think they've you know, they don't really see any use for it. So I think that change happens. There's generational change. And of course, studies have shown that what really changes male behavior is the activities of their peers. So when other men are also engaged in a lot of caregiving, that makes a change, you know, makes that changes things. So I'm quite optimistic that we can degender caregiving. I think social change like that happens in complicated ways. There's, you know, resistance, there's the backlash, but there are also people who just kind of continue in sort of on the path, you know, toward justice. And regarding Hannah's question about the Care Corps, you know, this is a proposal that I've made, and also two other philosophers have argued for it, Elizabeth Brake and Martha Nussbaum. And she asks also about whether about extending systems like AmeriCorps into early childhood education, and I haven't seen that specific proposal. So I think that's a really you know, interesting proposal. The Care Corps is not focused primarily on early childhood, right? And I think there is a specific set of skills needed there and competencies. I mean, that's such an essential stage. And I know Hannah's a child psychiatrist, so she could speak to this actually if we could pull her into the panel. But so, you know, I think that these are initiatives that, you know, we need to be looking into and thinking about. And of course, I mean, the way that sometimes sexism is so slippery, you know, the way that it works is that maybe as it gets more valued, that's great. The gendering might change too. So we might not solve sexism even if we solve the problem of the care crisis.
We only have about 10 more minutes, and one of the topics I know we all wanted to get to were solutions and possibilities and programs that we, you know, that are being experimented with and that seem to be improving access to childcare, the profession of childcare. And several people here have asked, Lauren asked, how is childcare expected to change in the future? And several other people had asked earlier about how do we get, Joanna, from policy to changing practice. So I wonder if we could take up in the last few minutes programs that you all have seen that you see promise in. You had already mentioned the one, Jennifer, I think it's at Kirkwood, the Learn and Earn. Is that what it's called?
Earn and Learn, yes. And I also, I just want to identify that this issue has so many layers to it. Asha was just talking about gender roles and you know, some of those issues is so interesting. But there's also just layers of issues when it comes to what preferences parents have. You know, my kid went to a Montessori. Some parents may want their child to have a religious or another kind, you know, the farmyard example. I think there's a farm child care center outside of Iowa City too. So parents, what they want and what they're looking for is so complex. And it's just something that we really need to acknowledge, that people need to be able to have choice. One of the examples that I like to highlight is from my hometown of Waterloo, Iowa. And there is a retirement community there called Friendship Village. And it's one of those full service, kind of like an Oak Knoll type facility. And they have, it's just a really interesting way of bringing this all together, because they have care providers, there's a nursing home, there's assisted living, there's food service workers, all these different jobs going on within that assisted living or that retirement community. So they built a child care center right there on their campus. And the interesting piece of this is they wanted to have a child care center on their campus, so that because their nursing home staff don't, they work early mornings, late evenings. They wanted to have that child care center right there on their facility, so parents could stop in and see their kids during the day, be able to drop them off early or pick them up a little late. But the other interesting thing that happened at Friendship Village is that the residents of the nursing home and the residents of the assisted living wanted to go and volunteer at the child care center. So it became just this really, and it still is just this really beautiful mix of people caring for each other. Literally, children of the staff are there, the staff's helping the people in the nursing home, and then the nursing home folks wanted to come over and rock babies or play with toddlers or just interact with the children. So and I think, going back to mental health, I think if we can find more solutions like this, where intergenerational folks are helping each other out. There's another great example in Polk County in Des Moines area of Lutheran Services of Iowa, getting grandmas and aunties the training and the skills that they need to be childcare providers for their nieces, nephews, and their grandchildren, and then also having the licensure that they need to be able to accept CCA or childcare assistance. So I think that there's no silver bullet. There's no one silver bullet. There's just going to have to be a lot of, I often refer to it as throwing spaghetti at the wall. We need to try some things. Not everything's going to work. But we will have some successes like the few that I just highlighted here.
It's really good to hear about creative programs that seem rooted in humane solutions as well as economic solutions. Yeah. Anything you would add to that, Asha?
Yeah, well, I think it's also valuable to look at sort of the tradition of kinship care in the African American community that so systems
You're freezing up a little bit. Asha. There you go. You're back.
Am I freezing? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're back.
So okay, great. So kinship care, I think, also has value, and thinking about extended families and how to sort of socially support extended families is also, something to consider. So that, of course, happens in a lot of different communities. Roberts's work on kinship care shows that.
Oops. You froze again.
Actually, once it gets regulated by the state, sometimes there's too much state supervision.
You froze again for a minute. Asha, you were saying Robert's theory about kinship. That's when you disappeared.
Kinship care. So can you hear me now?
Yeah.
It might be windy. The internet connection can get funny if it's windy. So yeah, I mean, I think in addition to looking at professionalized care, which is really, which is a crucial part of this. I would say, among the solutions to have in the mix of a just society are solutions that do make room for families to care for each other, that do make room for extended families to care for each other, that recognize the validity of those caring relationships, of caring relationships beyond the nuclear family. And there is a long history there that Dorothy Roberts talks about in terms of kinship care, where grandmothers and aunts have provided a lot of care for children. And because it was not provided by the nuclear family, it was often understood to not be legitimate care, or that children were not thought to be cared for well, but they were actually receiving good care. So we have to really, I think, also pay attention to the ways that the caregiving practices in various communities might get devalued if they don't fit a certain model, a certain normative model, and to be really attentive to the details of how care is happening in communities, what works, and also what are the effects of state involvement. So in the cases, Roberts writes about, once children are put into the there's state supervision for some benefits, that's also an occasion for more racism. So there's a complicated relationship between, state support can also include state sort of control and supervision.
Mhm. Interesting. We are just about at the end of our time. Cassie had asked if we could drop the Earn and Learn Kirkwood link.
I'm desperately looking for it real quick here. Did you see me like on my computer?
Huh.
Yes, I'm looking for it. So I haven't located it just yet.
Right. And Cassie, just as a reminder, in addition to that program, which is a really wonderfully grounded practical program, Jennifer also mentioned that UNI has the only early childhood major degree in of the 3 state institutions at least. And so, although Iowa used to have one, University of Iowa, but it was very good to know that UNI has that program too, for people who are really thinking about the professional side, in addition to the family side that Asha was just discussing. Well, we're at the end of our time, but I just want to thank Jennifer and Asha so much for really thoughtful, thought-provoking comments and insights. And I want to thank Jason again for always being such a great partner, and thank those of you who joined us for being with us. And we hope to see you at a future Obermann and ICPL conversation. We'll just keep an eye on the Obermann website in the spring semester, or sign up for an Obermann newsletter, and we'll be delighted to keep you posted. Thank you so much.